Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, for making the time this afternoon to join me and Dr. Suzanne Simard and all your fellow Episcopalians and non-Episcopalians who love trees and care about the earth. Thank you. In just a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Simard and she will speak and then take some questions. We will be recording this today. We are recording now, and by tomorrow it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. You'll be able to go to St. John's Episcopal Church, Boulder, Colorado on YouTube and find it there. You are welcome, as Dr. Simard speaks, to put your questions in the chat feature. My request is that you keep them as short as you possibly can, because I'll be looking at them and trying to pull from them and give them to Dr. Simard, who will become Suzanne here in just a moment. If you have any technical issues today or have any questions, you will see we have three co-hosts, Mari Pichel, Alexandra Goodman, and Heather Dudok. And you can see on their screens the word co-host is in capital letters. So they're here to make your flight more enjoyable. So just sit back, relax. No, they're here to help you. And thank you, Mari and Alex and Heather, for doing that today. So 2 years ago, I read an article and it had a passing mention of Dr. Suzanne Simard's work. And I was really intrigued. Shortly thereafter, I read the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Overstory, and I wondered if the fictional character of Dr. Patricia Westerford in that book was inspired by Dr. Simard, and it turns out it was. And I actually preached about that character. I drew her into a sermon because I said the way that she approached her work was one of the finest illustrations I had ever read of God calling someone into vocation. And then this spring, when I read Dr. Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest, I had that very same sense again, that God was working in partnership with her, calling her to be a prophet. And that's my word for her. That's not a word she claims for herself. And I said to her before we began today, I'm sorry, I just, throw that word around. So you just kind of settle into it and get used to it. And if you think of a prophet merely as somebody ranting and raving on a street corner soapbox, that is too small a definition. Prophets are people who are invited into the heart of God, and they see there the injustices and the brokenness of the world. For the divine heart is where all of those wounds are carried. Suzanne Simard has seen firsthand the injustices done to the intrinsic dignity of trees, the intrinsic intelligence of trees. And she came to understand her life's work was to bring that injustice to the attention of the world and to call for change in forest management and practice. If you have read her book, you know that did not win her droves of friends, nor did her imaginative and groundbreaking scientific research. Nonetheless, she kept at it. That's a calling. Dr. Simard, Suzanne, it has been my dream to host you at St. John's since I first read that article in 2019. We are a faith community with an abiding commitment to social and environmental justice. And I am so thankful this day has come and so grateful to you for being with us. And I hope that one day I get to meet you in person and that maybe we can take a walk in the woods together, because it is a holy place. So it is my pleasure to give the floor to you, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you. My heart is like, wow, this, and I actually, I agree. I feel, I mean, I've never thought of myself as a prophet, but I am trying to help the world see the forest in the way that I see it, and the way I think it truly is expressing itself, so that we can better, help forests, to better look after them, to fulfill our obligations to them, to care for them. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to give a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to take you on a journey. And the journey is, it really is it's a sort of a smaller journey that I express in my book. It's an abstract of that, I would say, but it definitely is a journey. And I think in telling of the story, that you will understand my vocation and the message that I'm trying to tell the world. And that, and really, I have to say too that, as a person who has lived in forests and grew up in forests, that I am just a vessel of their wisdom, of the intelligence of trees and the wisdom of forests. And they have taught me this, and I'm just here to express what I've learned from them. So with that, I'm going to share my share my screen. Oops, let me see. I'm not sure if I know how to. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Share. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'm going to go from the beginning. And here we go. Great. So I'm going to start with this spiral. The image of a spiral is something universal in humanity, through many cultures, including our Western North American cultures, multiple cultures. And I'm going to express my story as a spiral, where I start in the middle, as we all do when we're born to this earth from our ancestors, in the grace of God, that we grow from this place that, many people think of in the East, and spiraling out. And as I grew and started to understand the forest, I learned so much. And as I spiraled around, you can think of it sort of like an eagle spiraling higher and higher in the sky. I got a better view. It started with my heart, and now I've brought in all my senses, my intellect, all that the trees have told me. And I'm see the trees, the forest, as a part of our larger environment, our earth, our biosphere. It's an integral part of it, and we are part of it too. We're all in this together. And so this journey, of course, is ongoing. I continue my work. It is going to be my work until I pass from this earth. And I've passed on my vocation to my daughters and to my students, and they carry the message as well, or the message is the science, the learnings that we have made. And of course, a spiral also means like kind of spiraling back down sometimes and being introvert and saying, what about these questions I'm asking? Are they the right questions? And then, after checking in, going back out and re-asking questions, diving in and trying to get at the truth, always trying to get at the truth. So I'm going to start by just centering ourselves a moment. So this is an old map, of course, of North America, prior to settlement by Europeans. And it shows, a subset, a transect of the original people that were here, the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people of North America. And where I'm from, and I'm not going to go into any detail other than I'm going to hone in where I'm from, which is in British Columbia on the West Coast. And I just want to start by saying I'm right now here in this little yellow area down here in a little town called Nelson. I'm in the unceded territory of the Sinixt Nation, as well as the Ktunaxa Nation. And many of the nations in British Columbia are unceded. That means that treaties have not been struck with the nations. The colonization that happened was quite with disregard for that. And now I feel like as we as a country are on our own journey of spiraling out, we're recognizing or trying to recognize the truth of what's happened and try to come up with a reconciliation with our First Peoples. And when we do that, we will be more helpful to our forests, more helpful to our children, more helpful to our societies. And I believe, and I can see on the ground that this is happening, and it's a really good thing. So I'm here. The work that I'm about to show you is actually not just in this area, but it covers this great big area where there are many nations. In fact, in British Columbia, there are over 203 First Nations, which reside within 30 language groups. So this is a very diverse area. And it's diverse because the land is diverse. You know, we are on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, which is an amazing thing. And we're a province, a place of mountains. And the oceans and the mountains come together to create this incredibly rich, productive, wealthy place that people have lived for thousands of years. And so that diversity you see here in the nations reflects the diversity of the land. And the reason that the nations and the land are married together in their diversity is because they are all one together. And this is a philosophy, a way of seeing the world, an epistemology, if you will, that I think that is healthy for people. It's healthy for all of us to see ourselves as part of the earth, as part of this land, and that we have much to learn from that. And once we re-engage with that, or better engage with that, we will have a better time dealing with our environmental and social crises that we're facing now today, including climate change. So let's go back to where I grew up. I grew up in the nation, the Splatsin, the territory of the Splatsin Nation, which is a smaller nation or tribe of the Shepamek Nation. And these nations lived, and I lived, my family were settlers that came from Quebec, lived in what we call the interior rainforests. So these are really productive forests. This is where, you know, the Pacific Ocean meets those mountains in the interior, and rain falls, and it falls and it falls, and snow falls, and the snow can be 3 or 4 meters deep in the winter. And it's relatively warm compared to the boreal forest, for example. And so it's extremely productive, and it's very biodiverse. These are what you often think of as the West Coast iconic forests, the ones that you think of when you think of traveling up to, you know, from California to Alaska. These are the forests that you will encounter, the huge cedars, the huge hemlocks. There are so many species that reside together. So I grew up in this forest, and I grew up in a family of horse loggers, and they worked in the forest from the late 1800s, selectively logging, and I grew up in that environment. That's what I learned. I learned about how to live in and with the forest. These forests are also salmon forests. So, you know, all of the streams in British Columbia, as well as along the West Coast, have the influence of salmon in some way or another. You know, closer to the coast, that influence is bigger, it's stronger. Inland, it's still very present. A lot of the people that live here and lived here consider themselves people of the salmon. And the salmon influences the forest in large ways. And I'm going to touch on that a little later. It's part of our research in understanding the integration of the oceans, the mountains, the forests, and all the creatures that live in it. And I'm going to also emphasize again that, you know, where my family settled, which was in the area of the Splatsin Nation along the Shuswap River, they were fishing for salmon for their livelihood for thousands of years. And they use all kinds of incredible fishing technologies, passive fishing technologies. And what we're looking at here is a weir. In this weir, they are, you know, basically there are slats. If you look along here, there are slats. So I'm getting right down into the nitty gritty here. And salmon will migrate upstream to spawn. And some of them, they will passively catch, the splatsin would passively catch for their harvest, and dry the fish and store it and so on for their winter food. It was what's called an honorable harvest. They never took more than they needed, or if they did, they traded it. And they always let the big mother fish go upstream. So they would catch the fish, as they were passing through the weir. And if it was a big mother fish with large, they have large eggs, they're very fecund, they create large little fish, and they would let them go upstream. And in this way, they could keep the populations really strong and healthy. And so the populations of salmon actually, under the stewardship of the First Nations throughout the land, actually grew over the centuries and millennia. They grew larger and bigger. This little area down here, back here, I think is for counting fish. So not only were they observant of letting the mothers go through and then only harvesting the smaller fish, they also counted fish, so that they always knew the variability in the populations. So then if the population was low, they would take less. If it was abundant, they took more in that year. And of course, populations varied naturally over the years, but also varied according to the harvest. And so they were very sensitive to that. And I would say all the nations all throughout the West Coast were like that. They knew what the populations were, they counted the fish, and they adjusted accordingly. This is another method of fishing. This is on the Fraser River. You might have heard actually in the news about a little town in British Columbia that burnt to the ground in the last 2 weeks from a wildfire, the little town of Lytton. This is Lytton. And these are fishermen fishing at Lytton. These are First Nations of the Lillooet Nation. And they have a different fishing technology. You can see the Fraser River is very rapid. It's a glacier-fed river. A man falling into this river would drown for sure. And yet this is where they harvested salmon, because salmon migrate up this beautiful, huge river. And so the way that this worked is they would have dip nets. This is a dip net right here. Or they would have spears. Here's a spear right here. And a man would spear a fish, a large, like huge fish, and bring it back up. And behind him would be his wife, his children, and they would gut the fish and put it up for drying all in one big movement. It was, an incredible thing to watch. And I was fortunate that I was working at that time in this area, and I was able to observe this fishing practice. But again, they were very astute, very sensitive to the populations of the fish. They knew what was going on. Here's another fishing technology. This is actually a satellite imagery looking down, or an air photo. It's an air photo looking down. And this is on the ocean. And it's hard to discern, but here are the treetops in the shadows. And you see these circles, these concentric circles. These are what are called ancient tidal stone traps. And this is a fishing technology too. So what this did is there are many nations along the coast, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Haltzik, the Kwakwaka'wakw, who built these ancient tidal stone traps. And so they had, in the estuaries where the salmon would go up to spawn, they built these rock walls in the ocean. And the tide would come in over top of the rock walls, and then the tide would go out. And on the ebb tide, so that's the low tide, they would catch the fish that were entrained behind the rock wall. So they kept the smaller fish, but they left the big mother fish to go upstream to spawn. And so in so doing, they were able to, again, keep track of the populations, but also ensure that the populations were healthy and strong. Now, there's been a lot has gone on since these ancient fishing technologies. In Canada, with the colonization of Canada, that fisheries was taken over by the federal government. And a lot of these technologies were either outlawed. In this case, they were not allowed to use their stone fish traps, and they certainly weren't allowed to sell their fish for their livelihoods. And that still is true today. Now, I'm bringing this up because we all know that our salmon fishery is in a lot of trouble right now. In this last century, we've gone from very healthy populations to just a few percentages of what was here before settlement. This is, it's discouraging, but there are ways to reinstitute these old technologies. And I'm going to come back to that later on. This is some of the research I'm doing with the Tsimshian Nation, is to try to restore some of these technologies. And, the joy, the connection of the people with the land, with the salmon, with the cedar trees, the tree of life. Cedar is known as the tree of life in the Coast Salish people and the northern tribes and nations. And it's celebrated in their art, in their longhouses. This is the front of a great house, a big house. They call them a big house, a longhouse. And many families would live in a house like this, usually of a clan, like the Raven clan or the Bear clan or the Wolf clan, and illustrate their art. And so this is two salmon being celebrated by the chief here, and about the abundance of the harvest, this honorable harvest. And you can find this celebration throughout their art. Okay, so this brings me to my work. So I grew up, in a province where the salmon fishery was declining very rapidly, where the harvesting that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my father and all my uncles practices was no longer practiced. The horse logging was, it still occurs in small amounts, but it was taken over by industrial harvesting, industrial forestry. And that industrial forestry really meant, I'm going to just admit this one person who's trying to get in, it really meant clear cutting. So clear cutting means taking away all the trees. And to me, this was about taking a forest that was about connection, right? Connection and relationships among trees and plants and people. People are such an important part of the forest. I think I tried to illustrate that these practices, this industrial practice, was about taking this highly connected place, which was built on relationships between these creatures, and disconnecting that place. And what I saw when the forest was disconnected, the old trees were harvested, replanted to plantations of one species, the native plants weeded out, literally taking out the trees and plants that were not wanted because they were thought to be competitors, that I started to see that these forests were becoming sick because, this reduction in biodiversity, this changing of these old forests, which I called the Cathedral Forest, it was really, shrinking it down to such a simple thing, such a simple crop. And so I started looking at these connections, and I'd learned about this study that was done actually in a laboratory in the United Kingdom by a British scientist who had taken pine seedlings into the laboratory, grew them in these little garden boxes, and he colonized them with these fungi that he knew were helper fungi for trees. They were called mycorrhizas. And mycorrhiza literally means fungus root. It's a relationship. It is a relationship. It's a relationship between the tree and the fungus, where the tree provides photosynthetic energy that is taken from the sun, converted it to chemical energy, and it trades with the fungus for nutrients and water. The fungus grows through the soil, picks up and brings it back to the tree. And so it's a symbiosis, and it's a mutualistic one. It's one where they both benefit. And all of the trees all over the world and all the fungi in this particular group depend on this relationship to reproduce, for their livelihood, to carry their genes forward, to exist. And so I wanted to find out if we were disconnecting if these networks existed in our forests. And if they did, were they being disconnected by our practices? And so I went into these old forests where I grew up. Yes, and let me come back to this. This is just a word. This is a Coast Salish word that illustrates, I think, what I'm trying to express. This word it's netsamast. It means we are one. This is a concept, right? It's a concept I'm trying to illustrate here, that we are all connected in this way. We have these relationships, these connections to the earth. And every Aboriginal language in the world has, I think every one that I've learned about has a word for this idea, this worldview, that we are all connected together. And this is this, sorry, I'm sort of jumped ahead of myself. This is that little study done by the British scientist David Reed, who grew these little pine seedlings in these little boxes and saw them linked together by these mycorrhizal fungi. This is the mycorrhizal fungal network that grows through the soil and links these trees together. And what he did is he took some carbon dioxide with carbon-14 attached to it and labeled this tree and was able to actually trace that carbon moving through the roots and into this mycorrhizal relationship, this fungus that linked these two trees together, and it traveled all the way into the neighboring seedling and right up into the shoot of that neighboring seedling. And so I was wondering in my forest that we were disconnecting with clear cutting and planting. Were we disrupting this network? And so I went into my forest to test this very thing. And just to get a closer look, if you look very closely at these are the root tips of one seedling, another seedling, and the fungal mycelium that connects them together is almost like a telephone line, right? It's actually a physical connection. And it turns out in my earlier work in looking at these forests and are they connected? What do these connections do? So I found out that they are connected. They've got many species that link many tree species together, many fungal species linking many tree species, and that they transmit through these fungal pipelines, basically, all kinds of resources. So resources being carbon and nitrogen and water and phosphorus, and information like, how healthy am I? And who am I? What is my species identity? What is my genetic identity? Where do I come from? And what kind of health am I? Am I stressed? Am I happy? Am I being attacked by something, or am I fine? These trees are communicating this information through these little pipelines every moment, every day, through the night, through the month, through the year, through their entire lives. Okay, so that actually got met with all kinds of pushback from the academic community because I was challenging this idea, or not even just an idea, it's a theory that's embodied in Darwinianism. And Darwinianism really took Darwin's original observations, which were really rich. He was a great scientist and observer, and he understood that that species develop through interactions, through relationships, that the development of whole genotypes arose from relationships, just like our personalities arise from relationships with each other. And he knew that tree, or all these different organisms, speciation occurred because of that, through competition, through collaboration, through all kinds of relationships. But the idea that competition was so important took hold in our politics. It took hold in our way that we manage the environment. It took hold in our social networks. And we see that today. We see it in forestry and agriculture. And in forestry, in application of this idea in forestry, it meant going into forests and getting rid of the plants that we didn't want, because competition was viewed as the dominant factor that would structure a forest like this. And so I hit a lot of controversy. I hit a lot of pushback because there's a whole industry associated with this. And so I thought, what I need to do to help people understand is keep going, right? Keep persevering, keep uncovering that treasure box to see what's in it. And so I went and I uncovered this forest, and I made a map of what that network looked like. And I published it with my graduate students. And so basically, it took us 5 years to make a map. And we made maps of 6 forests just to show people, and to ourselves, to learn ourselves of what this network looked like underground in a real forest. This is a special forest. It's Douglas fir. I think you have Douglas fir in Colorado. And it's a forest with elder trees, so old trees that are 200 to 300 years old. Youngsters, so germinants, seedlings, teenage trees, young adult trees, all ages and all sizes. And this was a great forest to study because I thought that it could help me understand how that forest grew up, within that structure, that network, that connection. Okay, so I'm going to show you the map that we made. And this is, it's made with a lot of love, a lot of care, and a lot of math. And what this map represents is that it's an area of about 100 feet by 100 feet in a forest. And these circles represent trees. And the bigger the circle, the bigger the tree. And the darker green the circle, the older the tree. So this tree here is about 250 years old, and it's a big tree, right? These little seedlings down here are small, and they're, at the most 10 years old. And then we've got some, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 80-year-olds, the whole age range is in here. And so what did we find out? Well, for one, think about this. These lines here are the fungal threads that link these trees together. So, and we looked at one of the species of fungi out of 100 in this forest. So this is a very simplified map, right? If we had been able to map all 100 species, you probably wouldn't see any white underneath there. It would all be black. It would be completely networked. So here's the main findings. For one, we found that every tree is connected to every other tree. And even multiple times, and through a lot of complexity, where this tree is actually connected to this tree, but there's a lot of hop, skips, jumps, and in between things that link them together. So it's it's what we call a complex network. It's actually called a neural network. These are biological neural networks. That pattern is a neural network where you've got big hubs and then a bunch of smaller nodes that are intermediates. So that's one thing, is that every tree is linked to every other tree. These big trees are the most highly linked. So this tree in particular is linked to 80% of the other trees in this forest. So these big old trees are highly linked because they have big root systems, and they have big crowns with lots of photosynthetic ability, and they put a lot of energy below ground into the network, and that network supports and feeds and nurtures the rest of the forest. Okay, so these big old trees are highly connected. And so we started doing a bunch of experiments with these big old trees to find out, how did they do that? What is it? What's the process? What's the mechanism by which they nurture the forest, which is what we suspected based on the pattern. Because really, all of these younger trees have established within the network of the old trees. They've grown up in the lap, in the apron of the old trees. And so the way that that happens is that the seeds will fall to the forest floor from these old trees. They send a little root down. That root becomes colonized by this vast network within a month or two, and they start taking up nutrients from that vast network already. You could think of it as, a child growing up in a family with a lot of care and knowledge and wisdom that is accumulated over the generations. It's the same thing with these little seedlings. The other thing we found, we did a lot of labeling with isotopes of these big old trees to find out, what are they, if they're sending anything to the seedlings directly. So we knew they were supporting the network that these trees established in, but were they sending anything directly? And we found that they do. They send carbon and nitrogen and water. They send, and that's the basics, right? They also send a lot of information. And so this tree, for example, we went on to carry on more experiments. We grew a lot of seedlings around these old trees, where we allowed them to connect into the network of the old trees, and then we didn't allow them to do that. We isolated them. We made them orphans from the forest, and we found their survival rate was only a quarter of that of their neighbors that had connection to the network. The next thing we asked is, did it matter if you were the offspring of those old trees? And it turns out these old trees can actually recognize which one are their own offspring. It's called kin recognition. Kin recognition, we know happens in us. We know our babies and our families. Kin recognition, we know happens in animals, but it was really elusive to us with plants, because we often thought of plants and trees as things and never thought to even ask the question. But my graduate students and I got together with some other scientists, and we asked that question. And it turns out that Douglas fir recognizes its own kin, its own offspring, its own siblings. And the amazing thing is that they send more carbon to those little seedlings to support them. They even change their own rooting behavior to make elbow room for the seedlings. And they provide more carbon to the network to support the mycorrhizal network, to support the seedlings. And so this really is, I'm sure this you would think of as collaboration, but this is exactly what Darwin was trying to talk to us about, right? It's about the myriad ways of survival, of supporting the community, survival of your own genes, carry on your own species. This is happening even through kin recognition in trees. So there's so many things, there's many other exciting things, but I'm going to move on and just talk a little further. This is a mother tree. If you've thought about, if you've wondered, it's when you walk in the forest and it's the biggest trees that you see. They're just the ones that stick out of the crown of all the others. And they're often, if it's in a multi-age forest, they'll be the oldest trees as well, just because they have big crowns, big root systems, big capacity to share. So they're easy to spot. So elders then, what does this mean about elders in communities? Well, let's go back to the First Nations cultures in British Columbia, even our own cultures. Elders are so important. We know that. Elders are important in forests too. They're nurturing, they have wisdom, they uphold the community. And in this particular example, this elder, the name of elders in this particular language is called Ketiak. It's a Coast Salish language. This is a Coast Salish. And the word elder, it doesn't describe him, it describes his role in the community, his role to uphold the others, to share his wisdom, to look after the resources, the salmon, the trees, the forest, to help the whole community thrive and be rich in life, rich in life. I don't mean in money, I mean in healthy living. So it's the same in forests. These old trees have a role. They have the role of being the elder in the forest. This is just a photo just to show, how closely knit the generations are in all of our forests. I showed the multi-ages. A lot of these forests are, even if you don't plant them, they're chock full of seedlings that are coming up. They burst out of the ground. The seeds fall and they burst out of the ground. And on most of these trees that you would see regenerating here are related to these old ones that are around them. They're all, related. They're all related at some point together, and as you get further and further away, that relationship gets less and less, but they'll be related to the old trees around them. So it's very obvious and visible in the forest. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the Salmon River now, just to try to close that story that I started out with. So this is an old village in the Selfsacrificing territory called Huat. It's a 6,000-year-old village. And this village, kind of when colonization happened, a lot of the First Nations people were removed from the land and put in reserves. And they've been looking after this land for thousands of years. And they're still, to this day, still removed from their land. Their youth are removed from the land. The elders are removed from the land. But in this community, they've reestablished that village. And they've reestablished the tidal stone traps out here. Here you can see some of the remnants of that trap here. They've restored the clam. They have clam gardens where they actually create like an aquaculture, where they create stone beds, and the clams will start to regenerate on those stone beds, and then they harvest the clams. They've restored, their forest. So the forest, for example, the cedars, they nurture those cedars for different uses. So for example, an old cedar tree, the people, and my own postdoc is a traditional salmon weaver herself, traditional cedar bark weaver herself, and they would strip the bark from the trees only to a certain degree, and then the tree would start to heal over. But those trees then became later really good. The way that they were shaping and the way they were healing over created sort of a hollow in the middle, and those trees became the canoe trees. And so they were able, through cultivation practices of a succession of practices, if you will, from cedar bark stripping to canoe building, they were able to cultivate trees for their own uses. And of course, the salmon and the trees and the oceans are all connected, and the people are all connected together. So let me just talk a little bit about that. I mentioned how the salmon travel upstream during the spawning season. So they would travel upstream to their natal streams where they were born, and they would spawn, lay their eggs and spawn. Well, it turns out that deep in these forests, when the salmon are spawning in the fall, that the bears love those fish, as do the eagles and the wolves, and of course the people too. But along the spawning banks, the bears are waiting in the fall. So in another month or two, the grizzlies will be coming down to the spawning rivers, and they'll be fishing. They'll be trying to pack on the weight for hibernation. And a single grizzly bear like this can actually eat up to 175 fish in a day. And the way that they do this is they take the fish from the spawning beds and they carry them into the forest. And they really especially love the big old trees, the mother trees. And they'll settle down under the mother tree with their cubs, and they can see everything, the predators all around them. And they'll eat parts of the salmon, but they leave most of the flesh to decay in the forest floor. They just eat the high energy parts like the brains and the guts, because, and they leave most of the flesh, which is what we like, which is kind of odd, but it's odd for us to think of that way. But that flesh, as it decays, actually seeps into the forest floor below these old mother trees, and the mycorrhizal network picks up that salmon, and they take it into their heartwood, into their sapwood, and they store it in their tree rings. And we've been able to go back into these old forests and start coring trees. Here's a decaying salmon, and we can core the trees and we can look for salmon nitrogen. And the way that we do that is that there's an isotope of nitrogen, N15, which is a heavy isotope, which accumulates in the salmon in the ocean. It's kind of like bioaccumulation, if you will. It accumulates, and so it serves as a natural tracer for the vector from salmon from the ocean into the forest. So we use that as a tracer. We actually go into those tree rings, we shave them down, grind them up, and put them through a mass spectrometer, and we can reconstruct how many salmon spawned in that river in that year. And we can do that in a 1,000-year-old tree. We can reconstruct an 1,000-year history of the salmon runs. We can even tell when those stone fish traps were dismantled. We can tell when the salmon fishery was taken over by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. We can tell when we have successful reestablishment of the salmon populations. And one of the things that my postdoc and I are doing is we're going back to the Selfsacrificing Nation, and we are reestablishing those old tidal stone traps. And we're measuring this nitrogen 15 in the trees and in the soils, and we're hoping that we can not only restore the salmon populations, but we can demonstrate to people that there are ways to recover our wonderful salmon populations. There are ways that we can do this. We can be careful stewards of our environment as well. We can also do the honorable harvest that Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks about so eloquently in her own book. And this creates healthy forests. So salmon are like fertilizer to the forest. The trees are immense. And these trees have feedback loops to the streams. So they shade the streams, they provide organic detritus to the streams that decays in the streams, that provides food. And it kind of closes the loop, because these little salmon fry are dependent on that shade, they're dependent on that food. And so the forest is giving back in a way to the salmon populations. They're sort of cycling around each other, making sure that all of these populations, the trees and the salmon and the bears and the wolves are healthy through this feedback loop. Okay, I just want to add one more story here, that the nations, this is an example of cedar bark stripping. So this tree they take a little section about, not very wide, no more than a third of the circumference of the tree, and make a cut at the base. And they do it in the springtime when the cambium is still fresh and it's still quite wet and moist. And so they make a cut in the base and then pull the bark off in long strips that go all the way up the tree. And then they roll up that cedar bark and dry it, and then work with it to make their baskets and mats and hats and clothing. And here's an interesting thing. You see this tree here. This is a maple tree. This is a big leaf maple tree. It turns out that maple trees form the same kind of mycorrhizas as cedar trees, and that they're actually linked in their own special network of arbuscular mycorrhizas. And so when Teresa, my postdoc, the salmon fishery scientist, who's also a traditional cedar basket weaver, goes to find her trees to strip bark, she always looks for big leaf maple because she knows that they're connected together and that the maple also loves the moist recesses in the soil where it's wet and productivity is high. And this is what she looks for when she goes to harvest her cedar. So I think I've illustrated to you these connections, right? The connections between the people, the salmon, the trees, the water, the oceans, the land, the mountains, we're all connected together. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about a disconnect that I want to bring up. And this is something that we as Canadians are struggling with a lot right now. And you've probably heard that we've had residential schools across Canada where during colonization, the government of the day in the early, in the 1800s really wanted to assimilate the First Nations people into European culture that was moving across Canada, and took the children from the Indians, basically, put them in residential schools, took the kids away from their parents, and tried to take the Indian out of the child. And what we found what we're finding this summer through this year is the uncovering of the graves of many of these little children that died at the hands of the people that ran these residential schools. This is a shameful mark on our history. And I bring this up because I've just painted for you a beautiful picture of the cohesion of the First Nations people with the land, their sophisticated way of being in the world, of harvesting resources while looking after the resources, and how we ignored that knowledge for so long. And also, did much worse than that. And now is a time to uncover the truth and reconcile with this and to come together. And I'm working with a number of First Nations right now who've come and said, let's work together. Let's take our knowledge and Western science, which is the little sister of Indigenous knowledge, and work together to find a better way. And so that's what we're doing. We're finding better ways to go back and not do sort of like this rapacious approach of clear cutting and taking all the salmon and all the cod and, pushing our resources to the brink of collapse. It's the same way that we treated the First Nations people, right? To take that and redesign this, reimagine this. Let's get together and work together to make a healthier environment, to solve climate change, to stop the destruction of our old forests, which is continuing on to this very day, to the point where in British Columbia, we only have 3% left of our iconic old growth forests, like that picture I showed you in the beginning. We're at this point where we have to do something. We have to take bold, transformative action. And I know that through my work that we have the tools to do it. We have the will, we have people who are making, as you say, the vocation, the prophets are there, the scientists are there, the big thinkers are there, the leaders, the faith leaders are there. We can do this. I know that we can do it. So it's hopeful to me. Kids are depending on us to do this, as you guys all know. This is at Fairy Creek, which has been in the news lately over the huge protests of kids putting themselves on the line to stop the harvesting of these old ancient forests, which is going on this very day. The government is, pushing them aside and saying, we know better, we're going to go in and take these, but the kids know better. They know better. They know their lives depend on it. And they're working with the First Nations and our youth and fighting against these big powers to stop this kind of clear cutting that is taking over our land, that is ruining our forests. And it doesn't have to be this way. There are better ways to do it. There are better ways than this. This is on Haida Gwaii. Haida Gwaii is a famous place. It's where the Haida people live. It's a famous archipelago on the west coast of Vancouver, of British Columbia. This archipelago is slated, half of it is slated for clear cutting over the next 50 years. And this is the consequence. And the Haida people depend on salmon and forests for their livelihood. And so they're out there protesting as well. So this is the Haida people protesting that clear cutting. And I stand with them. I think, we need to stand with them to protect these areas. Our lives depend on it. And going back to this picture, this is home for, this is brought home to us every day here. the consequences of clear cutting, of reducing the biodiversity of our forests, of reducing the presence of elders in our forests, these old trees. These old trees are resistant to fire. They're the ones that, that help mitigate the spread of fire. And when we replace them with plantations of young flammable trees, we create hazardous conditions for all of us. Even, not allowing, First Nations burning on the land so that we could save the forests for, the money-making harvest that we were engaged in, that also has set up our landscape for more fire. So there are better ways to do this. And I have a project called the Mother Tree Project, where we're seeking better ways, which is really based on the old practices that my grandfather practiced, of saving these old trees, of saving the elder trees in different ways and configurations, so they can bring up the new forest, a new resilient forest that's productive and healthy. And, we've been doing it for about 5 or 6 years, and we're finding that it's really successful. Leaving these old trees, we save carbon, we keep carbon in the ground, we maintain biodiversity, and the forests just bounce back, they regenerate. So there are ways to avoid this kind of crisis out there. And so this is just a picture of the protesters at Fairy Creek. Elders, young people, First Nations, everybody's out there trying to change the way things are done. Okay, so coming back to my spiral, this has been a spiral, right? I'm journeying out. I sometimes go back in. I'm going to continue on. This is my vocation. This is my calling. The trees have spoken to me, the forest. I feel like a vessel for this knowledge. I feel like I'm a two-eyed seer. I can work with the First Nations. I work with my colleagues in Western science. We can come together. We have the heart, we have the knowledge, we have the power to do that. And so with that, I'm thank you for listening, and I invite your questions.
Suzanne, thank you so much. I think I'll just take a stab and speak for everybody. I think you took us to a different world and helped us look at the world we thought we know quite differently. I spent a lot of time in the coastal temperate rainforest of the Kenai Peninsula of Alaska for
Cool.
almost 20 years. And it is, as I said earlier, it's a holy place. So thank you for showing us that. I'm going to invite people to drop a question into the chat feature. And as we get going on that, so are any of the world's largest companies responsible for deforestation changing tack? Maybe the question is, and it aligns with one someone emailed me, are you finding, and sorry, questioner, if Nancy Jacobs, sorry if I'm misstating your question, but the other question I think was like this, you've got this incredible research and work out there. Is it affecting change? Is it affecting forest management policy in Canada and the United States? I mean, I know this is a dream for you, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it is. I think we're on the cusp of change. And I don't say that lightly, because I've been around for a while. I'm 60 years old. I've seen a lot. I've been very frustrated through my career at the lack of change, but right now it's different. And it's different because we all see the consequences. We're living the consequences. I'm surrounded by fire right now, and a lot of us are. And the big forest companies are they're getting pressured by the public who want change. We want our kids to have healthy lives. And we can see that, as they're harvesting and clear cutting the land, that we're even losing, they say, oh, we're going to provide jobs. Well, we've lost half the jobs. Like, jobs have declined by 50% over the last 10 years. So that argument doesn't hold water. People aren't fooled anymore. And so, yes, they still have their supporters, but the public is onto this, thankfully. And I'm seeing a shift in the big companies. it's not there yet, but they're still clear cutting like crazy. So for example, in British Columbia, I know these numbers don't mean much, but we've had an annual harvest of 70 million cubic meters per year for the last 20 years, and it's never deviated. And it's still the same, even as, our forests are declining and climate change is increasing, and we've turned from carbon sinks to carbon sources. We've lost so much biodiversity, it has not changed one iota, this level of harvest. That's the responsibility of the government who regulates the harvest, but it's also the responsibility of these big companies. So they lobby governments to maintain harvest levels so that they can continue to make profits, but they can see they're losing their social license to do that. People don't like it. And so the real concrete example of change is that in my project, the Mother Tree Project, which is leaving old trees, taking out a few, but leaving mostly old trees and trying to figure out what patterns are best for different environments that will still be resilient as climate changes. And they're collaborating with us. And so I have big companies that are part of the project. And at first they were kind of reluctant and resistant, saying, oh, it's going to cost us too much to do this. Well, in the end, they realized that they got their social license to practice again. The communities like it. And they can also see that these practices work, that they don't have to spend as much on planting trees because they just naturally regenerate. And so now I had one of the biggest companies write a letter in support of a grant that we just wrote to get some more funding to say, we're proud to be part of the Mother Tree Project. That's a big shift. I know it's small, but that's the beginning, right? And I think that now, the media, there must have been like 200 or 300 articles written in Canadian news over the last couple of months about old growth logging. People are upset about it, and there's a lot of pushback by the government and industry, but they're starting to. It's going to change. It's going to shift. We're going to keep going, keep doing the work, do the science, get the science out there, and it will shift. It's got to shift. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm guessing that the non-scientists among us can help this effort by pointing back to the science and advocating for a cessation of old growth forest logging.
Yes. Sorry, was there a question in that, or I was
No.
okay.
That was just that was a segue. It was kind of a rough segue, but it was the best I got. So there's a question here. Could you share a detail maybe about a tree or trees that help each other or one another at the expense of themselves? The self-giving love, the self-sacrificing tree. Does such a thing exist?
Sort of like altruism.
Yeah.
I think the best example, and I think, I think one thing to think about is, and I think of myself this way too, is that, I'm a person, but I am part of many people. I have generations before me and generations after me. And I have a responsibility to carry on from my ancestors and to pass on my knowledge to my children and to care for them. And trees do the same. And if that could be thought of as a selfless thing, but here's a concrete example. When an old mother tree is injured and dying, and so we've done this in the laboratory where we stressed, plants and trees and in the field, that they do a bunch of things as they're passing. One of the things is that they send information to their offspring. They send them information about upregulating, in a really genetic way, upregulating their RNA, and they start to produce enzymes that help them be tougher, resilient, to be able to fend off the, whatever is infecting them or attacking them, to make them a bit tougher, give them a tougher skin, so they're able to withstand that. The other thing that these old trees do as they're passing is they send a lot of their energy. So we've traced using carbon-13, actually labeling these trees and watched where their energy went. And a lot of it moves directly through the network into their neighboring kin seedlings, so their own offspring. And so there's a real, there is a purpose, I guess, in a genetic, generational sense, in survival of that gene line. But it's also, you could think of it as a selfless thing as well. Like, why would it distribute its energy in that directed way? Until this research, scientists thought that, old trees would die and then they just kind of fall over and decay, and their energy is sort of transmitted back into the ecosystem just through a general decay process. But here I'm showing it's actually not that at all. It's actually directed into the offspring.
Much more intentional. So that self-sacrificing then is maybe a characteristic of all trees in a forest, right? At some point.
Yeah, and also, a lot of people argue with me, or the geneticists will argue that, I always argue for diversity and community, right? That in forests, diversity is really important to bring up the whole community, because they have, different niches, they are able to access resources in different pools, and that increases the productivity of the whole forest. So diversity matters because they all have their different jobs. And so then people will say, well, that's not, we need to focus on one species because that will help that species survive and do better. And that's the whole premise behind forestry practices that focus on reducing competition. But I argue that they need this diversity, and these trees know that. Right? They know they need neighbors that fix nitrogen, and neighbors that resist disease, and neighbors that are shade, provide shade for the offspring, and neighbors that can access water deep down, all different species. It enhances the entire social fabric of the forest.
Okay, the questions are roaring in here. Where might somebody go to see a properly curated forest with mother trees? The question was, we're in BC, but maybe you can just think of a park or something where.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to think of a place. I don't know the US that well, but I do know of an example forest where they've done a really great job of looking after each tree, and that's the Menominee Forest in northern Wisconsin. I think it's Wisconsin, where they've done the selective harvest, this honorable harvest, like I've talked about, like I'm trying to work with our mother tree forest in the Douglas fir forest as well. And they've actually, through their harvest, they've actually been able to increase the productivity of the entire forest without clear cutting at all, with taking out this tree here, that tree there, nurturing the old trees. So that is probably the best example in the US. And in British Columbia, I would say it would be the First Nations forests that they've been looking after for thousands of years.
Okay, good. Thank you. Someone writes that the near Boulder, the Forest Service is doing some clear cutting in the name of fire mitigation. Where do you start in trying to work with an agency to stop that, or what's the alternative, or can you comment?
Yeah, we're having the very same issue here. So communities are being encouraged to what they call fire smart their forests, or to try to protect their communities. And there's always those individuals or companies or whatever that try to take advantage of that good intention. And so, for example, in this town near that I grew up in, my mom grew up in, my grandparents lived in, they're trying to harvest this whole mountain in the name of fire protection, but it's an old growth forest, and it doesn't need to be thinned out because it's already full of old trees that are fire resistant. So they're really just after the money, right? So I think educating is really important. So what I did is I went to that forest with the people of the community who were worried about this, that they were going to lose their community forest so somebody could make a pile of money. And we wrote letters. There's been like 100 letters written to the newspaper. I don't know about 100, maybe 20 letters written to the newspaper. I wrote a report. We just worked at it and worked at it and worked at it. And they're not going to harvest that forest because the people got together and they said, no, we don't want that. And so that harvesting agency didn't do it. So persistence, right? It's persistence and sticking to it, educating them, trying to talk to them. And then, the other part of it is there's science out there to support or to argue against some destructive practices. So there's scientific basis for partial retention of old trees. for fire mitigation instead of taking everything out, clear cutting, as it seems like that's what they're trying to do. Yeah, there's a science out there that shows that these big old trees and forests all around the world are important in fire mitigation. And they're important in keeping in carbon storage. We need both of those things. And so you can bring out the science. There's plenty of it out there. I mean, maybe, to lay people, it's not as accessible, but there is information. There's great scientists in the US that would support this. And so I think that's another feather in, that's another piece of a tool that you can use to talk to them and educate.
Great, thank you. If mycelium is used for medical practices in the future, would this threaten the life of the trees and rhizomes? Does this mess with right? We've just found this great network, and
yeah.
Should we just leave it alone, or what can you say?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a really great question. And certainly, I've had people come to me and say, can we engineer this so that we can sequester carbon or create medicines? And, those are, science is great, and it's great to try to explore these things, try them out. But there's, the one fundamental thing here is that the mycelium is dependent on a living forest, right? It needs photosynthesis, and it needs a healthy forest. So that's the place to start, is a healthy forest. And once you have that, almost everything else is taken care of. And certainly, the fear that, if we start, saying, oh, the mycelium is got all these answers, it does have a lot of answers. It's, 30% of our below ground carbon is stored in the mycelium. It's huge. So it is really important. It's full of medicines. People are using them to make clothing even, right? It's like people are becoming aware and using these materials, but fundamentally we have, or even, making bricks and, as a building supply, like instead of mortar and bricks, mycelium bricks, and can build buildings with them. But the fundamental thing here is we can't be destroying our ecosystems to produce these things, because they're dependent on healthy ecosystems themselves. So yeah, they're driven by photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is at its highest capacity when you have a healthy full forest.
So yeah, so the takeaway is don't disrupt the system, the family.
Yeah.
Another question, okay, fascinating that trees communicate with each other. How do trees communicate with us, or do they? Or,
that's a great question.
And what might they have to say, right? Suzanne, you're looking lovely today.
Well, one of the things when you go to harvest a tree for cedar bark, what I've been taught by the First Nations people is you put your hands on the tree and ask, right? Ask, is it okay if I take some of your bark? Is it okay if I take a plank from your stem to make a canoe or a house? Is this forest ready to be harvested? And, it doesn't have to speak back to you. You can tell, right? You can listen and watch, listen, and you'll know the answers, because we know, in your heart, but we know through various scientific tools that the answers are there, and the trees. So, and do the trees talk to us? They do in that way. Here's another thing. We've done so many experiments, right? So I'm going to get back into the nitty-gritty science of things. And we've done lab studies where we've taken seedlings and we've in the lab, and we've put little worms on them to chew their needles. We've picked their needles off ourselves. We've taken scissors and cut their needles off and looked at their responses. And they respond to us. They know when we're clipping their needles off. They know when we're peeling the bark off. They know how to heal over when that happens. And so they're perceiving us. And if you're listening, you'll hear the answers of whether or not you should be doing that or not.
There's a book, What a Plant Knows, about the senses of plants, and related and fascinating. Yeah,
you can put a little sound recorder on the trunk of a tree, and you can hear the sound of the tree inside. You can put a sound recorder on the mycelium, and you can hear the stuff running through the mycelium, the water and the nutrients. You can hear it. So we just have to open our senses and listen.
Thank you. Is there a way for consumers to know what companies use wood from sustainably managed forests?
Yeah, so this is an area where we need some work, but there is this thing called certification. So wood products can be certified by these third-party organizations that will come in and for a company and say, are your practices sustainable? And then they put a stamp on it, and then the consumer knows that that's a sustainable forestry practice that company is performing. The problem is that for some reason it got corrupted. The system got corrupted. That's my take on it, because every company now has certification. It doesn't matter if they're good or bad, they're all certified. And so then it's indistinguishable to the consumer. And so then it comes back down to the consumer to say, is this product coming from an old growth forest or not? So I would say that would be your first question. And my guess is that we're going to be moving, and I've seen actually this in the news that people are asking, and they are certifying, is this from an old growth forest? And then you say, I'm not buying that product. Boycott that product and tell your neighbors not to buy that product. And then you can buy more, we should be really just taking wood products from secondary forests that have already been harvested, where the losses in carbon and biodiversity have already occurred, so we don't incur more losses on our old forests. We have to keep, these old forests are absolute jewels for us now in our climate crisis. They store so much carbon, they're homes to biodiversity. So yeah, so being astute about that is really important.
Thank you. Just a few more questions. Is there hope that replanting clear-cut forests will help them develop into healthy, diverse forests over time? And I guess obviously the answer is it depends on how they're replanted, right?
Yes, it absolutely does. Yeah. Well, so I'll expand on that. So one of the things, as climate is changing, the velocity of climate change, the speed of it is really fast, right? And trees can't adapt as quickly as climate is changing. The rate of climate change is probably 1,000 times or more faster than they can adapt. They certainly can't move. I mean, trees can migrate maybe a meter a year. Climate change it's 1,000 meters a year that it's moving. So it's, in a whole order of magnitude too slow. And so for nature to keep up. And so what foresters and geneticists are doing is they're trying to migrate species. So move species around so that they might be their genes would be pre-adapted to a warmer condition. And so you would take a genotype from a warmer climate and move it to a colder climate so that in 50 years, it's well adapted to that changed climate. And so to do that, you have to plant, right? Taking seeds into the forest, a lot of that just gets eaten up. And so planting is a really good solution because they're already, big enough that they'll survive those first few years. And what we have found, we're doing this in the Mother Tree Project as well. We're migrating species to keep up with climate change. And we're finding that when we plant them around the big old mother trees, that they survive 20 to 30% greater than in a clear cut. And so, yeah, there is a place for planting, especially in the migration of species, and also just to augment, the natural regeneration in case there's some failure. So there is definitely a place for it.
So it almost sounds like if you couldn't talk a government entity or a logging company out of clear cutting, if you at least could talk them into leaving a mother tree in a clear cut and then plant it around it, you might have 25 to 30% better chance of quicker, more diverse reforestation.
Yeah. Yes, that's the basic concept. But one small thing I would add to that is that leaving single mother trees, they're very social creatures, right? Trees are social. And so if you leave it as a single, it's lonely and it's vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable to drought, insect infestations, just the shock of losing its neighbors. And so what we find is that when we leave just single trees, they call it the seed tree method in forestry, that we lose about 30% within 5 years just dying. They're just dying from a broken heart. I shouldn't say that. I mean, literally, they don't make it. And so what I'm trying and showing people is leave the neighborhood, leave the family. So leave clusters of trees and then they protect each other. They provide shade. They provide a moist environment. They provide, buffers against disease. They don't blow over in the wind. So leaving clusters is much more important, patches of them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are you good for a couple more?
Yep.
So somebody was thinking about your talk about the cooperation between maple trees and
Yeah.
it was either pine or cedar. They said, where can you get mycelium to enrich maple trees and pine trees? I'm assuming they're asking about the relationship.
Yeah. Our soils, if a healthy soil is full of inoculum already, it's full of spores and hyphae and all the things that are needed to make a mycelium, as long as there's a living plant there. And so in most cases, if it's a healthy soil, you don't need to bring anything, it's already there. But if you're in a degraded soil, say it's been left fallow with no plants on it for a long time, or it's been restored from a parking lot or something horrific like that, then you can actually bring in mycelium. And there's different ways you can do it. You can go buy inoculum from a nursery. You can actually buy the stuff. They're not locally adapted, so that's a bit of an issue, because we know that plants and mice and fungi are locally adapted to their local site, and then they do better because they've evolved together. But you can also, the other alternatives, you can bring in healthy soil from nearby and just sort of like topsoil and spread it over and dig it in, and then you can restore the mycelium that way, or establish the mycelium. But normally, that maple tree and that cedar tree will have ample, if you grow them from seedlings, say you want to plant a couple of, a pair like that, it's most likely the mycelium will already be there for you, and that they'll just colonize those trees, no problem.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have one last one. Actually, somebody was asking, have you found that tropical forests have similar neural networks? And I thought I heard you say that globally, all forests have these networks,
yes,
right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so and then the last question, are you familiar with cultural survival or similar organizations which support Indigenous cultures and the natural environments that they've lived in and lived in cooperatively for centuries?
Yeah, I haven't heard of cultural survival, but I know that there are great organizations that are emerging that are supportive and provide funding. And I'm working with one called Pachama, that they're about saving Indigenous forests for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. So they're supportive of that and supporting the Indigenous people to do that. I'm working with the Calliope Foundation, which is providing funding at the interface of culture and spirituality and ecology, including a lot of Indigenous support. So I mean, those are just two examples of what I know about, but I think that there are lots out there. And but I'm not familiar with cultural survival, but I'm glad to hear that exists.
Okay, great. Yeah. And I just realized somebody called my attention to a couple of questions that had come in early in June by email. Let me see if I can just distill these. So the questioner talks about climate change, warming, drying, species are migrating farther north, but that there's limitations. He's saying, are the mycorrhiza associated with these species? Are they migrating at the same rates? And do you see any potential for CRISPR technologies to develop modifications to arboreal species? I should just email you these questions that incorporate their own associations. He's wondering about Frankenspecies.
Yeah. I'll just say a couple of words about that. I had it in my mind a second ago.
I'm so sorry. It's a complex question, and I think I will just forward these to you.
I think that's great. Just the short answer is that the mycelium, the spores, they can all disperse much more rapidly than seeded plants because they're lighter, so I don't think that that's going to be the limiting factor. I think that seed plants like trees are going to be, those mycelium will be able to move faster than the trees, but they do need to move together because they are locally adapted. And then as far as the Franken mycelium, probably people are working on this. I don't work on it. I think that we need to be extremely careful. But I know that there's been success, for example, in the American chestnut in using, I don't know if it's CRISPR, but it's, basically making genetically modified trees that are resistant to the chestnut blight. And so I think that's actually a good application of that. But I think that we have to be extremely careful with these below ground organisms because some of them can become pathogens in new environments. And we definitely don't want that. They can become invasive and pathogenic, and we don't want that. So we have to be really cautious. And I would say that their ability to migrate is just on their own is just fine. And we should just let them do their good work on their own with that.
Thank you. I'm going to close the questions now. There are all kinds of expressions of gratitude coming in on the chat, and thank you everybody for sharing those. Suzanne, my final question is just a really simple one. What would you have us do? Right? Prophets. So to bring it back to prophetic, prophetic utterances or prophetic work, they're usually trying to get other people to do something, right?
Right.
And so you have us. What would you have? You have us listening. You have our hearts. What would you have us do?
Well, I think, I think we all want to have a healthy environment that we can live and thrive in and have our children live and thrive in and our elders. And so creating that healthy environment is paramount for us. And we're struggling as a human race right now because we've done all these things that are tipping the balance. And so I think if you can advocate for these, regenerative practices, less exploitive practices, mitigating climate change. I know you guys have talked about climate change, and I think that's wonderful. I think that, spreading the word about that it's so imperative that we address these fundamental issues. If we don't address the climate change issue, none of the tinkering that we do along the edges is going to help us. And so, getting, and the church is it's powerful. Religion is powerful, right? People have, passion and wisdom and voice. And I think you can use that power to move people to make these changes that we have to make them. So getting off fossil fuels is, I would say, if there's one thing, that would be it. The second thing was, let's try to save our old forests, because that's absolutely essential too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are all so grateful for you, for the work that you do.
Thank you.
The heart that you have for your work, and just the willingness you have to translate your work into language that the layperson can understand. And that is a tremendous gift.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Pastor Susan, for everything. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Take care.
Take care, you too.
And everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found this as absolutely wonderful as I did. So blessings, everyone. Take care.